He had 30 seconds to choose between the woman who broke his heart and the empire that could get him killed. That's not a movie trailer. That's a real choice a real man had to make. And by the end of this story, you're going to ask yourself what you would have done in his place. Because this isn't just a story about the mafia. It's not just a story about an ex-wife who suddenly wants back into a life she once walked out of. This is a story about power, about regret, about the terrifying moment when everything you thought you understood about loyalty gets turned upside down. Stay with me, because what happens in the next few minutes will completely change how you think about second chances. Picture a man named Daniel. Ordinary name, ordinary face. The kind of guy you'd pass on the street and never look at twice. 5 years ago, he was working a warehouse job, barely making rent, married to a woman named Rachel who eventually decided he wasn't enough. She left. No warning fight, no big dramatic scene. Just a note on the kitchen table and a closet half empty. Daniel spent the next year rebuilding himself from nothing, brick by brick, the way people do when their whole identity has been ripped out from under them. But here's where it gets interesting. What Daniel didn't know back then was that his quiet, unnoticed life was about to collide with something enormous. Something that would put his name in rooms he never imagined existing. Something that would eventually put a target on his back. Because 3 years after Rachel walked out, an old man named Salvatore Conti walked into Daniel's life. And nobody, not Daniel, not Rachel, not anyone who thought they understood how this story would end, saw what was coming next. Let's slow down for a second. Because to understand why any of this matters, you need to understand who Salvatore Conti really was. In certain circles, in certain cities, his name was spoken carefully, almost like saying it too loud might summon something. Conti wasn't a cartoonish villain from a film. He was something far more unsettling. An ordinary-looking older man who ran one of the last true old-world criminal networks left in the country. Quiet, calculated, patient. The kind of man who never raised his voice because he never had to. Salvatore had built his organization over 4 decades. Real estate fronts, shipping contracts, construction contracts that always seemed to win the bid. On paper, it looked like a boring empire of concrete and paperwork. Underneath, it was something else entirely, a machine built on loyalty, fear, and silence. And here's the detail almost nobody expected. Salvatore had no sons. He had a daughter, brilliant and sharp, who wanted absolutely nothing to do with the family business. He had nephews who were greedy, impatient, dangerous in the wrong ways. And he had years, maybe less than a decade left, according to doctors who didn't know who they were really talking to when they gave him his diagnosis. An empire without an heir is not stability. It's a countdown clock. And everyone close to Salvatore understood that when he was gone, without the right person standing in his place, blood would spill in the streets before the funeral flowers even wilted. So Salvatore did something almost nobody in his position ever does. He looked outside his own bloodline. Think about that for a moment. A man who built his entire life on tradition, on family, on old-world loyalty passed down through blood, decided the person he trusted most wasn't a relative at all. It was a stranger. It was Daniel. Now you're probably asking the same question everyone close to Salvatore asked. Why him? Why an ordinary man with no criminal history, no connections, no reason to ever be on anyone's radar? The truth is even more surprising than you'd expect, and we'll get to exactly how Daniel and Salvatore's paths crossed. But first, I want you to sit with the weight of what's actually happening here, because this is where the story becomes something bigger than crime and money. This becomes a story about what people do when they're finally handed power they never asked for. Here's how it started. Daniel, 3 years after his divorce, was working a modest job managing logistics for a mid-sized trucking company. Nothing glamorous, nothing dangerous, just spreadsheets, delivery schedules, and long hours. One of the company's biggest and most reliable clients happened to be a shipping firm registered under Salvatore Conti's network, though at the time, Daniel had absolutely no idea what that name actually meant. For months, Daniel handled logistics issues for this client with a level of precision and integrity that stood out. When shipments were late, he fixed it himself instead of blaming someone else. When a competitor tried to bribe him into leaking a delivery schedule so they could sabotage a rival shipment, Daniel refused, reported it, and lost a bit of business in the short term because of his honesty. That single decision, one moment where Daniel chose integrity over easy money, reached Salvatore's ears. And in a world built on betrayal, an honest man is rarer than gold. Salvatore began watching Daniel from a distance. Quiet inquiries. Background checks disguised as business due diligence. He learned about Daniel's failed marriage, his solitary lifestyle, his lack of family ties that could be used as leverage against him, and strangely, all of that made Daniel more appealing, not less. A man with nothing to lose and nothing to protect except his own principles was, in Salvatore's eyes, the safest kind of man to hand power to. Think about that for a moment, because it's going to matter a lot later in this story. The very heartbreak that once made Daniel feel like a failure, the divorce that left him isolated and unattached, became the exact quality that made him valuable to one of the most dangerous men in the country. Sometimes the worst chapters of our lives quietly become the reason for everything that follows. Salvatore made his first move carefully. He invited Daniel to what appeared to be a routine business dinner, a thank you for years of reliable service. Daniel arrived expecting handshakes and small talk. Instead, he found himself sitting across from a man whose calm, unreadable eyes made the hair on his arms stand up before a single word was spoken. Salvatore didn't waste time with pleasantries. He asked Daniel one question that changed everything. If you knew a secret that could destroy powerful people, and keeping quiet meant staying safe, but speaking meant doing what's right, which would you choose? Daniel, confused but honest, said he'd choose what's right, even if it cost him everything. Salvatore smiled for the first time that night. That answer, apparently, was exactly what he needed to hear. Now here's where most people watching this would expect Daniel to immediately be pulled into some flashy criminal underworld, but that's not how it happened, and that's what makes this story so unsettling. The real world doesn't work like the movies. There was no dramatic initiation ceremony, no guns on the table, just a slow, deliberate courting process that took almost a year. Salvatore began giving Daniel small responsibilities disguised as ordinary business tasks. Oversight of certain shipments, reviewing certain contracts, attending certain meetings as a silent observer. Each task seemed harmless on its own, but together, they were teaching Daniel how the machine worked, piece by piece, without him even realizing he was being groomed for something enormous. By the time Daniel understood the true scope of what he'd stepped into, he was already too valuable, too trusted, and frankly too deep to simply walk away. And this is where we need to pause and ask an uncomfortable question. At what point does a person lose the ability to say no? Most people believe that if they were ever pulled into something dangerous, they'd immediately recognize it and run. But real manipulation, the kind used by people like Salvatore, doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come wrapped in warning signs. It comes disguised as opportunity, as trust, as feeling valued for the first time in years. Daniel, still reeling from a divorce that made him feel disposable, was suddenly being told by one of the most powerful men he'd ever met that he was exactly the kind of person the world needed more of. That feeling, being seen, being chosen, is one of the most powerful psychological forces a human being can experience. And Salvatore knew it. He built his entire recruitment strategy around it. This is a mistake so many people make in life, not just in crime dramas, but in relationships, in jobs, in everyday decisions. We confuse being chosen with being safe. We confuse feeling valued with actually being protected. Daniel felt more respected in those months working alongside Salvatore than he had in his entire failed marriage. And that feeling made him blind to the risk quietly building around him. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. Not even Daniel. 6 months into this slow initiation, Salvatore sat Daniel down and told him something that changed the entire trajectory of his life. He said, "I'm dying. Not next year. Not in 5 years. Sooner than that. And when I'm gone, this family will tear itself apart unless the right person is standing where I stand now." Daniel assumed Salvatore meant one of his nephews, or perhaps a trusted lieutenant who had been with him for decades. Instead, Salvatore looked him directly in the eyes and said, "It's going to be you." Let that sink in for a moment. A man with no criminal background, no bloodline connection, someone who 3 years earlier had been quietly rebuilding his life after a painful divorce, was being told he would inherit control over one of the most secretive and dangerous organizations in the region. Daniel's first instinct wasn't excitement. It was fear. Real, physical fear. Because he understood, even without fully knowing the details, that stepping into this role wasn't like accepting a promotion at a normal job. There was no clean exit. No 2 weeks' notice. No walking away if it didn't work out. And yet, something else stirred in him too. Something he wasn't proud of admitting even to himself. A part of him, the part still bruised from feeling replaceable in his marriage, whispered that maybe this was his chance to finally matter. To finally be powerful enough that no one could ever discard him again. That single, quiet thought is the most dangerous thought in this entire story, and we're going to come back to it later because it explains almost everything that happens next. For weeks, Daniel wrestled with the decision. Salvatore didn't pressure him. In fact, Salvatore's patience was almost more unsettling than pressure would have been. He told Daniel, "A man who takes this position out of fear will fail. A man who takes it because he understands responsibility will succeed. Decide which one you are." During this period of uncertainty, something happened that nobody, especially Daniel, expected. Rachel came back. Now, here's what you need to understand about timing, because timing in this story is almost cruelly poetic. Rachel didn't come back because she suddenly missed Daniel's personality or realized she'd made a mistake walking away from their marriage years earlier. She came back because word had begun to spread, quietly, carefully, through certain social circles, that Daniel's fortunes were changing. That he was suddenly being seen in different rooms, with different people, wearing better suits, driving better cars. Rachel didn't know the specifics. She had no idea about Salvatore, no idea about the criminal empire waiting in the wings. All she knew was that her ex-husband, the man she once viewed as unremarkable and unambitious, was suddenly becoming someone. And this is where the emotional core of the story truly begins, because Daniel now had two enormous forces pulling at him simultaneously. One offering him unprecedented power and purpose. The other offering him something that, deep down, a wounded part of him had wanted for years. Validation from the person who once made him feel like he wasn't enough. Most people watching this will already have an opinion about what Daniel should do. But before you judge him too quickly, ask yourself honestly, if the person who broke your heart suddenly wanted you back, right when your life started improving, would you really be able to see clearly? Would you be able to separate genuine love from timing, from ego, from the desperate human need to prove you were worth staying for all along? This is exactly the psychological trap Daniel found himself in, and it's a trap so many people fall into without ever realizing it. We call it the vindication trap. It's the powerful, almost addictive desire to be wanted by the very person who once rejected us, not because we still love them the way we used to, but because some wounded part of us needs proof that we were never actually unworthy. Rachel reached out first through a mutual friend, then through a text message that felt casual but was clearly calculated. She said she'd been thinking about him, that she made mistakes, that she missed what they used to have. Daniel read that message standing in the same kitchen where she once left him a note explaining why she was leaving. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here's where most people expect a simple, predictable outcome. Either Daniel forgives her completely and welcomes her back with open arms, or he angrily rejects her and moves forward. But real human emotion, real complicated history between two people who once built a life together, rarely works that cleanly. Daniel agreed to meet Rachel for coffee, telling himself it was simply to gain closure, to finally have the conversation they never had when she left. But somewhere beneath that rational explanation, a small, wounded part of him wanted to see if the feelings were still there. Wanted to know if maybe, just maybe, this could be a second chance at something he once desperately wanted to work. Meanwhile, Salvatore continued preparing Daniel for the role that awaited him, unaware, at least initially, that Daniel's personal life was suddenly filled with distraction and old wounds resurfacing at exactly the wrong moment. This is where the story takes its first major turn, because Salvatore was not a man who tolerated distraction, especially not from the person he intended to hand his entire empire to. One evening, after weeks of secret meetings between Daniel and Rachel, meetings that started as simple coffee and slowly evolved into dinners, late-night phone calls, and lingering questions about what their future could look like, Salvatore called Daniel into his private office. He didn't yell. He never needed to. Instead, he simply asked, "Do you think loyalty and love are the same thing?" Daniel, caught off guard, didn't have an immediate answer. Salvatore continued, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "Loyalty is chosen every single day, through action, through sacrifice, through discipline, even when it's inconvenient. Love, real love, is the same. But infatuation, the need to be wanted, the need to prove your worth to someone who once discarded you, that's not loyalty. That's not love. That's a wound talking." Daniel felt his stomach tighten, because somehow, this old man who had no idea about the specifics of his relationship with Rachel had seen straight through him. Salvatore then revealed something that shook Daniel to his core. He had known about Rachel's return from the very beginning. Every meeting, every text message, every quiet moment of doubt Daniel thought was private. Now, before you assume this is some over-the-top thriller cliché, understand why this detail matters so much. In organizations like the one Salvatore ran, information is everything. Trust is verified constantly, quietly, without the person being tested ever realizing it. Salvatore wasn't spying on Daniel out of paranoia. He was protecting an investment, an heir, a future that depended entirely on Daniel's judgment remaining clear and uncompromised. And this is where Salvatore delivered the line that would echo through the rest of Daniel's decision-making for the remainder of this story. The woman who left you when you had nothing is not the same as the woman who wants you now that you might have everything. Ask yourself honestly which version of you she's actually coming back for. That single sentence hit Daniel harder than anything else in this entire journey so far. Because deep down, in the quiet moments when he wasn't distracted by nostalgia or old feelings, Daniel already suspected the answer. He just hadn't been ready to face it. Let's pause here for a moment, because this is exactly the kind of psychological insight that applies far beyond mafia dramas and criminal empires. How many people in real life experience this exact pattern? Someone leaves when times are hard, then mysteriously reappears the moment success starts to show. It happens in business partnerships, in friendships, in family relationships, and yes, painfully often, in romantic relationships. The uncomfortable truth is that not everyone who comes back into your life is coming back for you. Sometimes they're coming back for what you've become, for what you now represent, for the version of you that finally looks the way they always wished you had. Daniel left that meeting with Salvatore feeling like the ground beneath him had shifted. For the first time, he began quietly testing Rachel, small things, subtle questions, watching how she reacted when he intentionally downplayed his changing circumstances versus when he let slip small hints about the opportunities coming his way. What he discovered over the following weeks was heartbreaking, but not entirely surprising. Whenever Daniel spoke modestly about his life, when he downplayed his growing influence, and simply talked about ordinary things, Rachel's enthusiasm noticeably cooled. But whenever certain details slipped out, mentions of powerful new connections, expensive dinners, respect from people who mattered, her attention sharpened immediately. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't cartoonishly greedy. Rachel wasn't some over-the-top villain twirling a mustache. She was human, flawed, and like so many people caught in complicated situations, likely telling herself a completely different story about her own motivations. But patterns don't lie, even when people do, sometimes even to themselves. This realization forced Daniel into one of the most painful moments of self-reflection in his entire life. Because accepting the truth about Rachel also meant accepting a harder truth about himself. That some part of him had spent years chasing validation instead of genuine connection. That his marriage, even before it fell apart, may have been built more on the need to be seen as enough rather than a foundation of true partnership. This is often the hardest lesson anyone can learn about heartbreak. Sometimes the relationship that broke us wasn't broken by the other person alone. Sometimes it reveals wounds we were carrying long before we ever met them. Wounds that made us vulnerable to exactly this kind of painful pattern repeating itself. Now here's where the story takes an unexpected emotional turn that even Daniel didn't see coming. While wrestling with the truth about Rachel, Daniel found himself growing genuinely close to Salvatore, not just as a mentor preparing him for a dangerous role, but as something resembling a father figure he never had. Daniel's own father had passed away when he was young, and something about Salvatore's blunt honesty, his refusal to sugarcoat painful truths, filled a void Daniel didn't realize had been empty for decades. This relationship became the emotional anchor of the entire story, because it forced Daniel to ask himself an even bigger question. Was he being groomed to inherit an empire, or was he finally being shown, for the first time in his adult life, what real, unconditional guidance actually looked like? Salvatore began sharing pieces of his own story, carefully, deliberately, teaching Daniel not just how to run an organization, but how to survive the psychological toll that came with immense power. He told Daniel about his own early years, decades earlier, when he too had been an outsider brought into a world he didn't fully understand. He spoke about the mistakes he made early on, trusting the wrong people, letting ego dictate decisions that should have been made with patience and discipline instead. One story in particular stuck with Daniel deeply. Salvatore explained that early in his rise to power, he had been betrayed by someone he considered a brother, not blood, but bond. That betrayal cost him nearly everything, and it taught him the hardest lesson of his life. In this world, and honestly, in life itself, the people who hurt you the most are rarely strangers. They're the ones closest to you, the ones you never expected to turn. Daniel couldn't help but wonder if Salvatore was speaking generally, or if he was quietly warning him about something specific happening in his own life at that very moment. As the weeks passed, Salvatore's health began visibly declining. The urgency of preparing Daniel for succession grew heavier with every passing day. Meetings that once felt like casual mentorship sessions became intense crash courses in negotiation, conflict resolution, financial structuring, and the delicate art of maintaining loyalty among people who had every incentive to betray you the moment you showed weakness. During this period, Daniel met the other key players who would eventually determine whether his transition into power would be smooth or catastrophic. There was Marco, Salvatore's most trusted lieutenant for over 20 years, a man who many assumed would naturally inherit leadership. Marco was skilled, respected, and dangerously ambitious, though he masked it well behind a calm, professional demeanor. There was Angela, Salvatore's daughter, who wanted nothing to do with the family business, but who Daniel quickly realized held more quiet influence than anyone gave her credit for. She understood the organization's inner workings better than most of the men who worked directly within it, simply because she'd been observing it her entire life from the sidelines. And there were the nephews, two younger men whose greed and impatience made them the most immediately dangerous people in this entire situation. They didn't bother hiding their frustration that an outsider, someone with no history, no bloodline, and no proven loyalty in their eyes, was being groomed to take control of something they believed was rightfully theirs. Tension in this world doesn't explode immediately. It simmers, quietly, patiently, until the right moment arrives for it to boil over. And that moment arrived faster than anyone expected. Salvatore's health took a sudden, sharp decline. What doctors had once estimated as years left suddenly shrank to months, then weeks. The urgency to finalize Daniel's succession became a matter of survival, not just for Daniel, but for the stability of the entire organization. Salvatore called an emergency meeting with his closest circle, announcing formally, for the first time, that Daniel would be his successor. The room's reaction was immediate and electric. Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The nephews exchanged a look that promised trouble long before either of them spoke a single word. Angela, interestingly, said nothing at all, simply watching Daniel with an unreadable expression that unsettled him more than outright hostility would have. That night, as Daniel drove home, replaying the tense silence of that meeting over and over in his mind, his phone buzzed. It was Rachel. She wanted to talk. Something urgent, she said. Something important about their future. Now, here's where the two enormous forces pulling at Daniel's life finally collided head-on. Because that same night, as Daniel prepared to meet Rachel, Marco reached out to him privately as well, requesting an urgent, off-the-record conversation. Two people, two conversations, two decisions that would determine the entire trajectory of Daniel's future. Daniel chose to meet Marco first, partly out of caution, partly because something in his gut told him this conversation couldn't wait. Marco didn't waste time with pleasantries. He told Daniel plainly that the nephews were already discussing options to eliminate him before Salvatore's official transition of power could be completed. Not metaphorically, not through political maneuvering. They meant it in the most literal, terrifying sense possible. Daniel felt his blood run cold, but Marco wasn't finished. He revealed that he himself had been approached by the nephews, offered a position of power if he simply looked the other way when their plan was executed. Marco, despite decades of loyalty to Salvatore, admitted he hadn't immediately refused. He told Daniel he needed time to think, time to decide where his true loyalty actually belonged. This confession terrified Daniel far more than the threat itself, because it revealed something crucial about the world he was stepping into. Loyalty here wasn't guaranteed by history or years of service. It was constantly renegotiated, constantly tested, and dangerously fragile even among people who had spent decades building trust. Marco eventually told Daniel that he had ultimately decided to remain loyal to Salvatore's wishes, but he warned him plainly, "You need to prove, quickly and decisively, that you deserve this position. Because right now, all you have is Salvatore's word. And Salvatore won't be here much longer to protect you." Daniel left that conversation shaken to his core, understanding for the first time the true weight of what he'd agreed to step into. And then, just hours later, he met Rachel. She was emotional, tearful, more vulnerable than he'd seen her since before their divorce. She told him she wanted to remarry him, that she'd made the biggest mistake of her life walking away, that she wanted to build a future together, starting immediately. Daniel, exhausted, terrified, and emotionally raw from everything happening around him, listened carefully, searching her eyes for the truth Salvatore had warned him to look for. And then he asked her one simple question. "If everything I had right now disappeared tomorrow, the money, the connections, the opportunities, would you still want to come back?" Rachel hesitated, just for a moment. But in a moment like that, a hesitation says everything. She recovered quickly, insisting of course she would, that it had nothing to do with any of that. But Daniel had learned enough over these past months to recognize the difference between an immediate, instinctive answer and one that required careful reconstruction. That hesitation confirmed everything Salvatore had tried to warn him about. But here's what makes this story so much more complicated and human than a simple morality tale about greed and betrayal. Even after recognizing the truth about Rachel's motivations, Daniel didn't immediately walk away. Because understanding something intellectually and being ready to let go of it emotionally are two very different battles entirely. For days, Daniel found himself caught in a painful internal war. Logic told him clearly what Rachel's return truly represented. But a wounded, lonely part of him, the same part that had felt discarded and unworthy for years after their divorce, desperately wanted to believe this could still be real. That maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild something genuine, even if the timing looked suspicious. This is one of the most important truths about human psychology that this entire story reveals. Knowing the truth doesn't automatically heal the wound that makes us vulnerable to ignoring it. Daniel returned to Salvatore, this time not for business guidance, but for something closer to personal counsel. He admitted everything. His suspicions about Rachel, his fear about the nephews, his uncertainty about whether he was truly ready for the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. Salvatore listened patiently, then told him something that would ultimately define the rest of Daniel's journey. He said, "Power doesn't create character. It reveals it. Everything you're feeling right now, the doubt, the temptation to go back to something familiar even when you know it's wrong, that's not weakness. That's being human. But leadership means choosing what's right even when the wrong choice feels safer and more comfortable." Then Salvatore said something that struck Daniel even harder. The people who truly love you are the ones who stay when you have nothing to offer them, not the ones who return the moment you have something worth taking. Daniel finally understood, completely and painfully, what he needed to do. He met Rachel one final time, not out of cruelty, but out of the need for honest closure they never had years earlier. He told her calmly that he understood why she left, that he no longer blamed her for wanting a life that felt more secure and stable at the time. But he also told her, gently but firmly, that he could see clearly now why she'd come back, and it wasn't because of who he truly was as a person. Rachel didn't take it well. She grew angry, accused him of being paranoid, of letting dangerous new people in his life poison his perception of her. But Daniel remained calm, because for the first time in years, he wasn't making a decision based on fear of being alone or the desperate need to prove his worth to someone who once discarded him. He was making a decision based on self-respect. This moment, though quiet compared to the looming danger from the nephews and the criminal empire waiting to be inherited, was arguably the most important turning point in Daniel's entire personal transformation. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do isn't confronting external enemies. It's finally recognizing and rejecting the internal patterns that made them vulnerable to being heard in the first place. With Rachel finally out of his life for good, Daniel turned his full attention toward the far more dangerous threat still looming. The nephews planned to eliminate him before Salvatore's transition of power could be completed. Working closely with Marco, who had ultimately chosen loyalty over the nephew's offer, Daniel began quietly gathering information, understanding exactly how deep the threat against him truly ran. What he discovered was more elaborate and dangerous than he initially feared. The nephews hadn't just been planning to eliminate Daniel. They'd been quietly building alliances with a rival organization, promising valuable territory and resources in exchange for support once they seized control. This revelation meant the danger wasn't just internal anymore. It threatened to spill into open, violent conflict between two powerful criminal organizations, something Salvatore had spent decades carefully avoiding. Angela, Salvatore's daughter, finally broke her long silence during this critical period. She approached Daniel privately, revealing that she had been quietly monitoring the nephew's activities for months, suspecting their ambitions long before anyone else took the threat seriously. She told Daniel something crucial. Despite wanting nothing to do with running the organization herself, she deeply respected her father's judgment, and if he believed Daniel was the right person to inherit this responsibility, she would do everything in her power to help ensure that transition succeeded, even if it meant working alongside a man she barely knew. With Angela's inside knowledge, Marco's loyalty, and Salvatore's remaining influence, they began quietly dismantling the nephew's plan before it could be executed. The confrontation that followed wasn't the explosive, action movie showdown you might expect. It was something far more realistic and, in many ways, far more tense. Salvatore, despite his failing health, called one final meeting with his entire inner circle, including the nephews. In front of everyone, he laid out clearly and calmly everything Daniel, Marco, and Angela had uncovered about their betrayal and their secret alliance with a rival organization. The room fell into a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Salvatore then made a decision that surprised everyone in that room, including Daniel. Rather than ordering violent retribution, the response so many would have expected in this world, Salvatore instead stripped the nephews of any future claim to power or resources within the organization, banishing them entirely from any involvement, but allowing them to walk away alive, on the condition that they never attempted to interfere again. Confusion rippled through the room. Even Daniel, who had learned so much about strength and discipline from Salvatore, didn't immediately understand this decision. Later that night, Salvatore explained his reasoning privately to Daniel, a lesson that would shape how Daniel eventually chose to lead once the responsibility became entirely his own. He said, "Violence breeds more violence. Every enemy you destroy instead of neutralizing becomes a story other people tell about your cruelty, not your strength. Real power isn't measured by how many people fear you. It's measured by how few people actually need to." This philosophy, so different from the brutal stereotypes often associated with organizations like this, revealed something important about why Salvatore had survived and thrived for decades, while so many of his rivals eventually destroyed themselves through unnecessary violence and paranoia. With the immediate threat neutralized, Salvatore's health continued its steady decline. The final weeks of his life were spent almost entirely focused on ensuring Daniel was fully prepared, not just to run an organization, but to carry forward the deeper philosophy that had allowed Salvatore to build something that had lasted far longer than most of his rivals. In one of their final conversations, Salvatore told Daniel something that captured the entire emotional heart of this story. He said, "I didn't choose you because you have no fear. Everyone has fear. I chose you because your fear never stopped you from doing what was right. That's rarer than loyalty. That's rarer than power itself." Daniel sat with his mentor in his final days, not as a subordinate preparing to inherit an empire, but as a man who had genuinely come to love someone who had given him something no one else ever had: complete, unwavering belief in his character, even during his most uncertain moments. When Salvatore eventually passed away, the transition of power, though still filled with quiet tension among certain factions, proceeded largely peacefully, thanks to the careful groundwork laid over the previous year. Daniel stepped into his new role, not as the man who once felt disposable after a painful divorce, but as someone who had faced real temptation, real danger, and real heartbreak, and emerged with a clearer understanding of his own values than most people ever achieve in their entire lives. But here's the most important part of this entire story, the lesson that applies far beyond criminal empires and mafia successions. Daniel's transformation wasn't really about inheriting power. It was about learning to recognize the difference between being wanted and being valued. Between people who show up when you're struggling versus people who reappear once you've already fixed yourself. Between chasing validation from those who once discarded you versus building genuine self-respect that no one can ever take away again. Rachel's return wasn't really the villain of this story. She was simply a mirror, reflecting a wound Daniel had been carrying long before she ever came back into his life. And Salvatore, despite representing a dangerous and violent world, ultimately became the unlikely figure who taught Daniel the very lesson he needed most: that real strength isn't about proving your worth to people who once made you feel unworthy. It's about becoming someone who no longer needs that validation at all. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you found yourself chasing approval from someone who only showed interest once you'd already succeeded without them? How many times have you mistaken timing for genuine connection? This story, as extreme and dramatic as its circumstances may be, reflects a pattern so many people experience in far more ordinary versions of their own lives. The biggest lesson buried inside this entire journey isn't about mafia successions or criminal empires at all. It's about self-worth. It's about understanding that the people who deserve a place in your future are the ones who stood beside you during your most difficult chapters, not the ones who conveniently reappeared once your story started looking more impressive from the outside. Daniel eventually built a life defined not by fear or unchecked power, but by the quiet, disciplined wisdom Salvatore instilled in him during those final, transformative months. He led differently than most would have expected, prioritizing loyalty over fear, patience over impulsive violence, and long-term stability over short-term dominance. And perhaps most importantly, he never again allowed himself to chase validation from anyone who only valued him once he had something worth taking. If there's one thing you take away from this entire story, let it be this. The version of you that people abandoned during hard times is the same person you were all along. And anyone who only returns once you've become successful was never truly there for you in the first place. Real loyalty, real love, real connection shows up before the success, not after it. Before you go, I want you to think seriously about your own life. Is there someone who left when things were hard, only to reappear once your circumstances began improving? And more importantly, are you able to recognize the difference between genuine reconciliation and someone simply wanting a piece of what you've built without them? If this story made you think differently about loyalty, self-worth, or the quiet strength it takes to walk away from validation that isn't real, let me know in the comments below. I'd genuinely love to hear which part of Daniel's journey resonated with you the most. And if you found value in this story, take a moment to like this video. It genuinely helps this kind of storytelling reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe if you want more deep, emotionally driven stories like this one, and share it with someone in your life who might need this reminder today. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can inherit isn't money, or power, or status. It's the quiet, unshakable understanding of exactly what you deserve, and the courage to walk away from anything less than that.